Hello, good afternoon to all of you, and thank you all for coming to this event, which has been sponsored by the Brazil Initiative. As you're all aware, the Brazil Initiative is a very important happening on this campus to make Brazil central, not only to Brown, but to our part of the world. Africana Studies, Slavery and Justice, and also Race and Ethnicity. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to make just a brief statement before I introduce Professor Roquinaldo Pereira, who will introduce our speaker. I've been asked to draw your attention to two events coming up soon. The first one is an event by Professor Jeffrey Hall, Cattle Culture and Deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, coming up. And then also we have Fabiano Messonavi, who is a very important Brazilian journalist who spent time with us here, who's represented Folia in China and in Venezuela. So not to take up too much time, because really we are here to have contact with and interact with very important visitors. Let me just quickly introduce my friend and colleague, Roquinaldo Ferreira, who will then introduce the speaker. And once again, thank you all for making the time to come and be here for this historic Afro-Brazilian event. Okay.
Let me just say good afternoon to everybody. This is really, really special to me, very meaningful. I grew up in Brazil, as you know. I was born in Brazil. I went to college in Brazil, and I've learned so much from Professor Paixão's scholarship and his ability to bridge the gap between academia and the public policy making in Brazil at a time, some 20 years ago, beginning 20 years ago, perhaps even earlier than that, and shaping the conversation in terms of affirmative action in Brazil, in terms of racial inequalities in Brazil, at a time when there was so much silence outside academia. So, and his voice has so powerfully shaped the debate in Brazil that I feel very grateful to him. He has done stuff that very few people have been able to do that, achieve that level of resonance outside academia. And again, at a time when very few people could articulate the sort of argument that he has been able to articulate in such a sophisticated way for such a long time. Another interesting anecdote here, and I don't want to take too much time at all, is that we went, I met him personally here in Providence just a few minutes ago, although I feel like I've known him intellectually for a very long time. But we went to college together. So when I was invited in the same time frame, the same end of the 1990s, right? 1980s, actually, which makes me feel very old. So, and I was reading, as I was preparing for this task, I was reading this interview that Professor Paixão gave a few months ago to Globo, and to drive home his point about how much we've been able to do in Brazil in terms of affirmative action. And I know that we still have a lot to do. He made the point that when he went to college, there were only 4% of the overall number of undergrads in Brazil were Afro-Brazilians. And he joked saying that he could almost tell that because he was one of the very few in academia at that point in time as an undergrad. And that resonated a lot with me because I was there too. And we had to grapple with that dailiness of isolation, and that was quite something. But let me just get down to business here in a more official and formal way. Professor Paixão comes to us from the University of Texas, Austin. He is a professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of Texas, Austin. But he really made his career mostly in Brazil as a professor at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro in the Department of Economics there. His scholarship deals with race relations and inequalities in Brazil and Latin America, public policies, issues and monitoring, models of socioeconomic development, labor market, statistics of race and ethnicity, and gender inequality. His CV is long, way too long to go step by step over his CV. But the critical point is the point that I made before. Very few people in Brazil have been able to shape the conversation as Professor Paixão has done, has shaped the conversation. So please welcome Professor Marcelo Paixão.
Good morning or good afternoon for all. It's a big honor for me to be here in the so prestigious university, Brown University, and to see you, to have you in front of me beyond the university where I am, it would be a big honor for itself. Thank you for introducing me, and I'm very proud of from your words. And I would like to share with you some recent research that I have been doing in Brazil and more recently in Austin, Texas, University of Texas. I brought here 2 books, one and 2 of them I donated to all my friends, Professor James, Professor Anani, and I promised I will be back here in the Brasa, and I'll try to bring new ones and try to give you too. But I don't regret because I gave to Professor James 2 copies to give to the library, and I would like you can get in touch with these books, A Lenda da Modernidade Encantada, in Portuguese, 500 anos de solidão, and I will make a presentation this afternoon about this specific book, A Lenda da Modernidade Encantada. It is my dissertation work that I've presented in Brazil, in UPERJ in Brazil, and I launched this book about 3 years ago. And, well, okay, Legend of Enchanted Modernity. I will talk about a very important debate in which I try to articulate some debates about Brazilian social thought, about Brazilian nation building project, and more than this, about the problem of development in Brazil. And it is my main concern when I was studying to this dissertation, to this book. My main concern was to understand the articulations between the statistics that I was analyzing and why some statistics even showing so important, so visible racial inequalities in Brazil. Maybe sometimes I thought when I was debating in the Rede Globo, for example, and I was there, I don't know how many times, I felt some discomfort because maybe sometimes I thought, well, I introduced these statistics, but maybe the society, Brazilian society, naturalizing these statistics. Why? I'm talking about homicide rates, I'm talking about illiteracy rate, I'm talking about gender inequality, a lot of kinds of inequality, but in general, sometimes I thought, maybe they believe that it is normal, natural, and it's important to understand better why these statistics sometimes, why do they have so difficulties in really touching the hearts I don't know if you can understand what I mean. Well, so I believe that, first of all, I would like to talk about the Brazilian nation building project. And I believe that, first of all, based on the concept of Benedict Anderson, the national imagination, the nation building is a process of a collective imagination. Brazil, we have a collective imagination, which is the core of the national collective imagination in Brazil. Well, you have the Amazon forest, you have the samba, you have the carnival, you have a lot of marks of the cultural identity in Brazil, but I believe that I will not be far from of the reality if I assume that the core of the modern collective imagination in Brazil is that Brazil shaped or sheltered or has inside the country a racial democracy. Racial democracy as a kernel of the national imagination in Brazil. And I would like to reflect about this. Which is the meaning of this national imagination and the other possibilities that in general is hidden in the official discourse. And so maybe if I go back to Brazilian history, I would see that this kind of mentality, racial democracy, it is not typical, not just from the 20th century, but I can identify some traits of this kind of discourse even in the period of the colonial period. And why? Because there was in the colonial period a kind of discourse in Brazil that the relations between slaves or slaved and the master was more peaceful than in the US, for example. And so it's not hard to see it. A lot of books and a lot of description that tried to show. Now, in Brazil, the relations between slaves and master, they have a kind of sweetness, or a kind of intimacy. You can't see it in the US. Well, it is easy. I'm not making. I don't intend to make here a lecture about the historical traits of Brazil, but I think it would be easy to deny this kind of discourse. If I needed to open some historian research, our friend Flávio Gomes, for example, Mary Karash, a lot of historians that produced the analysis about the colonial period in Brazil, they described the reality of violence in the colonial period, imperial period in Brazil. But it's not my main question, but it's important to see, it's important to understand that this kind of discourse, racial democracy, has a strong roots in our history and in our collective imagination. But more important than what happened in the colonial period is what happened in the period in which Brazil was modernizing its social and economic structure. And the racial democracy is part of our national collective imagination, because this kind of discourse was part of a kind was part of that period in 30s in Brazil, 30s of the last century. There was a kind of interpretation that Brazil really, we had a different kind of society in that period, and this society, unlike the previous authors like Nina Rodrigues, like Oliveira Viana, like even Silvio Romero, they described the Brazil in a negative key. And from 30s on, the modernist intellectuals, the Brazilian modernist intellectuals, tried to describe Brazil in its positive way. In its meaning, well, first of all, racial democracy. Why it's important to analyze and to reflect the racial democracy? Because in the period when this discourse raised or arose, this kind of discourse, in Brazil they are assuming Brazilian population is mestiço. And why it's important to understand this, the strength of this kind of discourse? Because if you put this kind of interpretation in comparison with another countries, the Nazi ideology, fascist ideology that were trying to seek racial purification. And so it will be really, maybe you could think, well, maybe it's a revolutionary discourse, because we are assuming that Brazil is Brazil has a mestiço population, and this mestiço population is not a reason for to be ashamed, but it's a reason to be proud. And okay, it's good, okay, I can understand this kind of discourse, but even I could deny this kind of discourse, it would be very easy to deny it. Brazil is a racial democracy, but why does it not true? Well, if I had brought my research based on statistics, it would be very easy to show you the level of inequality, racial inequality in Brazil. But I believe that maybe this kind of statistics, as I've mentioned, are sufficient new for us, at least for us in this space. And I believe that you must deep something. We know that the racial democracy myth is a myth, that it's not true, but why does it so strong even today? And I try to think together, to reflect together with you about the strength of this discourse. First of all, I will try to understand the difference between this discourse and the US discourse about the national imagination. The US discourse about the racial, the national imagination would be based in a kind of idea that you have a big white country and you have the black, the Afro-American population, indigenous population. They are not part of the core of the nationality. But in Brazil, it does. And we can see, for example, that in another variable, for example, if I use the Max Weber interpretation about modernity or about the modernization. Max Weber had a very important expression or a very important understanding in which the modernization, when a society became modern, in the same time that this society would incorporate some values based on the principles of irrationality, based in principles of the individuality and so on, this society, the relations among individuals would be affected by the principle of the instrumental reason. And so they would be condemned to live inside the iron cage. And I try to understand this perspective of the iron cage, and I try to compare it with the Brazilian national discourse. Well, in Brazil, the modern discourse about Brazil, about the Brazilian identity, would assume, no, in Brazil, we didn't enter inside the iron cage. But why not? Because you have the samba, because you have the carnival. When you go to the streets now, last week in Brazil was the carnival. You would see the mulatas in the street, you would see the sambistas, the malandros in the street. No, this country is different. Brazil doesn't have the same level of problems that the modernity will include. Okay, but why? Because Brazil, in part, in part, at least in part, because Brazil is a racial democracy, and that's why Brazil, the racial relations, are more peaceful, they don't have any kinds of conflicts. When we were inside the debate of affirmative action in Brazil, some authors or some people that were against the perspective of the affirmative action in Brazil, they could, it was easy to hear from them. In Brazil, there isn't races. We can't describe races. We don't know who are black, who are white, who are indigenous. It's impossible. That's why it's impossible to have affirmative action in Brazil. Okay, let's try so to describe this discourse. First of all, Brazil is a kind of racial democracy, but there isn't races. Racial democracy without races. And first of all, I believe that there is at least a big contradiction inside this discourse. If the national narrative is based on the racial democracy, I believe that race will be present all the time, will be present since the roots of this kind of discourse. But it's not my problem. It's not my problem. Yes, you can assume. It's not, I know that the symbol of the national identity will be samba and carnival. It is based on race. African descendant culture, heritage in Brazil. Samba, carnaval, futebol. Okay. But what's the problem when I think in terms of the nation building project? Well, when I think that this kind of discourse of race is mixed to another kind of discourse that, well, really we have race in Brazil, but it's not the same as in the US, because in Brazil, unlike the US, you have a very big mestizo population. And that's why you can't assume, the official discourse would say, like this, that's why doesn't have in Brazil race, because there are mestizos. Take a breath. Okay. Okay. So we have mulattos, mamelucos, caboclos, morenos. What's the meaning of these words? Well, it's impossible to describe the word mulatto without describing the race, original race that form a mulatto, for logical reasons. Mulatto is the offspring of blacks and whites, or mamelucos, blacks, indigenous, or cafuso, blacks and indigenous, caboclo, indigenous and white, and so on, morenos, and so on. And again, the narrative that try to deny the presence of race will be reintroducing the same concept, or at least the same word, again and again and again. So, if someone says, well, we have now in Brazil a very big mestizo population. Well, it's impossible to describe a mestizo population without recognizing the presence of race again. Because it's impossible to describe a mulatto without the race mentality. Because it's impossible to describe a mameluco without a racial mentality, and so on. But it's not my problem. It's not my problem. Why it's not my problem? Because I believe that I could describe a person based on his physical appearance. He has a dark complexion, white complexion. It's not in itself a problem. It becomes a problem when I will describe this kind of personal characteristics based on some kinds of ideology that will assume that these different kinds of person have different kinds of possibilities, capabilities, and so on. And again, I can return to our debate. Is it true that in Brazil, every kind of mestizos are equal inside our society? Well, I remember a very important work by a Brazilian sociologist called Horacio Nogueira. And I don't know if you have heard about Horacio Nogueira and his work. And he told us that Brazil, he made a kind of ideal type based again in the Weberian concept. Brazil has a kind of ideal type of racial discrimination based not in the origin but based on the physical traits of someone. Maybe I could translate it racial prejudice of Mark of Horacio Nogueira. What is the racial prejudice of Mark of Horacio Nogueira? Well, if someone, even I know that this someone has 40 births that was not just European or white. This guy has African or indigenous ascendance. But if he is white in his physical appearance, he will be integrated inside the Brazilian society as white. And vice versa. If someone has European ancestry, if he's dark complexion, if he look like an African descendant person, he will be assumed inside Brazilian society as a black or African descendant person. It's important to see it's different from the US. Really, it's different from the US for original reasons, for historical reasons, and so on. Well, it's a kind of different kind of dynamic. But when I think of this kind of pattern in terms of the dynamic of the social inequality reproduction, well, it is easy to see that this, if someone is considered a white, he's a moreno claro, moreno escuro. Well, moreno claro will be white. Moreno escuro will not be white. Okay, but what will be the consequence? The consequence, and all statistics, all sociological, all anthropological studies will confirm someone who has white physical traits will be considered as white, and he will have a bigger probability to get jobs, better jobs, incomes, and social rights at all. And vice versa. If someone look like a black man or a black woman, this person will face the other problem. He will suffer the discrimination, the prejudice, and so on. And again, I believe that based on this kind of description, we can produce a kind of synthesis, first synthesis of our debate. First of all, it's not true that in Brazil there isn't race. Race is very important, not just in our national narrative, but in the dynamic of the Brazilian society. In second place, if it is true that in Brazil we don't have the same level of racial relation than you have here in the US or in South Africa or in other countries, we can't assume based on empirical or logical description, you can't assume that in Brazil we don't have a racial relation. We do have racial relations, but although based on different kinds of variables or dynamic. And this kind of synthesis lead me to ask the second question. Is there racism in Brazil? Because the racial democracy narrative is so subtle. Because sometimes I need to, I can reflect, well, is there racism in Brazil? Well, I've answered, yes, we have. But I can go to the another problematization, another question. Is that racism in Brazil? Because could have race, but not racism. And again, it's important to repeat. I know that it's the question that I'm raising now. It's not original. A lot of books that describe this, the Professor Anani article described the presence of racism in Brazil, but it's important to reflect mainly with in the US to American listener, because sometimes what we mean as racism maybe can face a kind of confusion, as a kind of a gray zone in which it is easy to forget what we are talking about. One thing is to have racial segregation, official racial segregation, racial conflict, Jim Crow laws, apartheid laws. If I describe racism based on this kind of criteria, I will conclude that no, in Brazil we don't have racism, because in Brazil never had Jim Crow. In Brazil never had apartheid law. No, you had, but someone could remind me, no, but in the colonial period, imperial period, since our first Republican Constitution, every citizens are equal under the law. 89-1 Constitution. We had a lot of mechanism of discrimination. I remember the legislation of Getúlio Vargas against African immigration, but I'm talking about the core of our legal structure. But I think it's important to highlight this aspect of the Brazilian society, because my answer is we don't need to have racial conflict to have racism. We don't need to have official racial segregation to have racism. Why not? Because in some countries, like in Latin American countries, it's not necessary. Or, better, it's more intelligent to discriminate without assuming I am discriminating. It's more intelligent, segregate without having any legal code, assuming that you are segregating. Why? Well, I believe that now in the US you are undergoing the post-racial society. You know why. I don't have a lot of times. I need to be restricted. I don't need to describe the level of subtlety, the level of intelligence of this kind of discourse that produce discrimination without discriminate, that produce segregation without segregate, that produce institutional racism without assuming it's an institutional racism. But again, my main question, I think it's important to reflect about this when I try to make some comparisons among countries. I think it's important to understand how this kind of racial pattern, because racism, the main function of the racism ideology is not to create conflict, it's to create inequality. Maybe racism ideology needs some level of conflict, like in the US, because of original reasons. The conflict had specific importance in the constitution of the US society, but in Brazil, didn't. But if I open, I maybe after the debate starting, I can read some passages of Oliveira Viana or Fernando Azevedo, trying to describe the level of subtlety of the Brazilian racism. But it's important to, again, I try to rebuild this, to reshape the line of my dialogue with you. First of all, in Brazil you have race, in Brazil you have racism, and this kind of racism, in part, it is not visible. First of all, well, because there is a kind of national narrative that you deny the presence of racism, and in part because it's a very intelligent strategy to guarantee the level of the racial inequality if I disenfranchise the discriminated population. If I take out to this population any possibility to resist. The illiteracy rate in Brazil nowadays, last census, illiteracy rate population over 15 years old, about 10%. Now, 60 years after the end of the slavery in Brazil, the illiteracy rate of the population over 15 years old was about 60%. In the same period in which the racial democracy was have been consolidating, 40, 50, 60, the literacy rate, half, middle of the population didn't know how to read or to write. It's a kind of disempowerment process. Now, if I open some recent statistics about, again, 50% of the black and brown women work in the labor market work without any social guarantee because they are occupied as maid, because they are occupied in low productivity sectors in the agriculture. Well, it's a mechanism of disempowerment. It's a very good strategy. If I take this population out, any kind of possibility of resistance, because, please, let's try to pay attention to our racial contract, using the word of Mill's words, Charles Mill words. Our racial contract, in part, is based on some level of acceptance of the Afro-descendant population to this kind of reality. But why do they accept? Because they are disempowered. It's a coherent mechanism. We know that there are a lot of resistance. You know that there are a lot of the black movement in Brazil is becoming more and more powerful. But let's try to be so honest. We know that we are far from to have in Brazil a collective or massive black movement organization. In Brazil, the Afro-descendant population sum about 100 million people. The Afro-descendant population in Brazil is 40 million people more than the Afro-descendant population in the US. If this population decided to raise, it will be impossible. Our society will be shaken on its structure. And so, again, the importance or the function of the national narrative based on the perspective of the racial democracy is because it can guarantee not just the white proud of the Brazilian society, but can guarantee some level of resignation of the Afro-descendant population. And it's important to assume it, to understand why so many inequalities and why you don't have massive movements against it. But I would like to talk about another thing. It's just a parenthesis. It was a parenthesis. My idea is to return to debate about problems of national collective identification and try to debate about the development model. And so let's repeat, let's try to come back to another aspect about the ideology of the racial democracy. Let's talk about Gilberto Freire. James, let's talk about Gilberto Freire. What's it important to talk about Gilberto Freire? Because he was one of the most important sociologists that described the myth of the Brazilian society. the racial democracy. But Gilberto Freire never used in his work the word racial democracy. Okay, no problem. Let's go directly to the point, the main point. Well, Gilberto Freire would assume that Brazilian society is formed by three main social players, white, black, and indigenous. And Gilberto Freire assumed that the miscegenation among these three original people generated Brazilian people. But Gilberto Freire told us something beyond this specific aspect. He told us about another thing. He told us that in Brazilian society, the African American the African Brazilian contributed with the carnaval, samba, happiness, and indigenous they gave their contributions in the food, some cultural behaviors, and so on. And the Portuguese. The Portuguese is the European part of the building of the Brazilian society, and the European gave the specific contribution. European was the rational part of the formation of the Brazilian society. So I had three different groups, and I know that one of this group contributed because they had the rational mind, and this kind of rational mentality would be important for the Brazilian society. And Gilberto Freire used that description. The Portuguese settlers had specific, if not exclusive, capability to build a civilization in the tropics. Civilization in the tropics. Why civilization in the tropics? Because in 30s, considering this mentality of the past, there weren't any civilized people outside or European or some parts of the Asian continent. And so, in the tropics, following Gilberto Freire's expression, we had Brazil as a good example of a civilization in the tropics. Okay. I will try to mix this kind of discussion with this classical passage of the political science theory about civilization and barbarian. Civilization and barbarian. Who were the civilized people? Portuguese. Who were the barbarian people? Indigenous and Afro-descendants. So, if in the Gilberto Freire discuss there was a kind of interpretation that Brazil was a mestizo population, there was in his discourse at the same time a kind of conception that there was a hierarchy in the colonial society. There was a hierarchy. So I will take this kind of discourse and I will try to dialogue with the modernization process of Brazil. We know that the Brazilian white middle class and upper class elites proud the Brazilian racial democracy. But you know that this kind of proud is based on some kind of discourse. And Gilberto Freire had a very important influence on this kind of conception, racial democracy. So, racial democracy, when you talk about racial democracy, please pay attention to. Racial democracy may mean country without racism. What can mean to another definition, a country in which there is a natural social position of different kinds of people inside the social pyramid, and so will be a convergence between social and racial line. There will be a convergence. Oh, Marcelo, you are exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating because I'm based on the Gilberto Freire discourse. Civilization, barbarian. Civilization in the top, barbarian in the bottom. White in the top, black and indigenous descendant in the bottom. But it's not my problem. My problem will be when this kind of discourse becomes a kind of kernel of utopia, of modernization of some country. It is part, intrinsic part of the modernization of Brazil. In its ideological aspect, it is. In its ideological aspect, but I believe it's important to pay attention to the ideological aspect of some modernization process. If the modernization process in Brazil is based on the conception of the racial democracy, because it defines our people, if the racial democracy discourse is based on hierarchy, natural hierarchy, oh my God. I don't believe we don't need to feel strange if in the end of an intensive process of modernization that the Brazilian society passed through during the last century, in the end of the process, what I will find? Inequality. But it's not the problem. Because it's not. Why it's not the problem? Because in the origin of the discourse, the inequality was not a kind of subproduct, negative subproduct of a good racial relations. Good racial relations, benevolent racial relations. The racial inequality is intrinsic to the own discourse. And that's why I am talking about a racial exchanged modernity legend. Our kind of modernity doesn't, I believe that you'll be able to remember, I was mentioning Max Weber description. Well, in Brazil, the Brazilian society didn't enter inside the iron cage. The Brazilian society is described to be a happy society, to be an open society, without racism, the cordial man. Okay, but it's important to assume that if the Brazilian society is a kind of alternative modernity that would like to teach the world, what the Brazilian experience can teach the world? How to combine modernization with inequality. How to articulate, how to join modernization with racial inequality. Naturalization of social positions. Joaquim Nabuco, someday, in his book, O Abolicionismo, told that the main trait of the Brazilian nation identity was the slavery. Every of you that remember what the nation means. Nation, it's the word means. Well, nation is based on the collective identification. And I believe that words of Joaquim Nabuco was very important because Joaquim Nabuco was denouncing the slavery system in Brazil, but he was introducing a very important aspect of the national identification inside the Brazilian society. The slavery was the kernel of the process of identification. And if I would like to recuperate that discourse into our current days, how could I redescribe this discourse? The kernel of the Brazilian national identity is the racial inequality. It will shape our society. It will shape our society because it will be accepted as natural, as normal. When some groups of the population will try to fight, to struggle for changing this situation, they would face a kind of resistance, a kind of argument. James, which was the argument? Professor Arnani, which was the argument? When you started producing your analysis about the Brazilian society, you are affecting our national identity, reasons of proud. You are commenting about something that it is better to shut up. Why? Because it's part of our natural process of identification. But what is the identification? Identification with the social peaceful, yes. Racial peaceful, yes. But the racial peaceful inside hierarchy. Or I am wrong. That's why Brazilian societies incorporate a changed modernity length. It's my personal interpretation to the racial democracy and its importance to the Brazilian society. That's all. Now, I will give the floor to my.
Yeah. Professor Paixão can field questions. Now, I myself have a question.
Okay.
Can I just begin with my question? Your assessment was very bleak, and I was wondering about blackness in Brazil and racial consciousness in Brazil, and how that has changed over the past, let's say, 10 years. I'm wondering about categories such as Negro, and this attempt to conflate and mestizos and so-called pretos to activate and give them some element of political leverage. I wonder if the system can be seen from a viewpoint that accounts for dynamism. And I don't see this as a top-down process. I see this as a bottom-up process in which, if it is changing, it's because people mobilizing to make it change. But the central question is about blackness. Has blackness changing? Has that changed in Brazil, the sense of blackness as a social and political identity over the past 10 years?
Yes, it is. I believe that the Brazilian, thank you for your question. I believe that the Brazilian society changed a lot in the last 10 years. And in part, this recent process is based on the growing or the strength of the black movement in Brazil. For example, I believe that maybe the most important example that I can give you is based on the statistics, the recent shift of the Brazilian racial makeup. Since the last 10 or 15 years, the white population in Brazil, the percentage of Brazilians those declare themselves as white decreased from 55% to 45%, about more or less about this. It's not exactly what I'm saying, but from 55% to 45%. In Brazil, I made a calculus how many Brazilians would change their answer to the to IBGE, to Brazilian official census, official statistics department or institute, and it would be about 12 million people. And it's not just a changing from white to brown. It's what brown to black. And I believe that because in census, it's a secret information, they don't need someone doesn't need doesn't have any reason to change this your own answer to the census or the PNADs or the sample interviewers. Why did it happen? I believe because there is a strong process of reconscientization or conscientization of the Brazilian black and brown Brazilian population in terms of this of blackness. I believe it's a very good example about this. But I will need to compare this information, this kind of optimistic information, I need to reflect it, not just in itself. I needed to see, for example, the percentage of Brazilians, black or brown deputies in Brazil. The percentage of deputies who are black and brown currently in Brazil is no more than 15%. But the Brazilian population is more than 50%. Oh, I think it is obvious that this kind of new feeling of blackness is being expressed through more cultural or social identification than in its political aspects. Or even if I would need to see the presence of the black movement organizations in Brazil, they are weak yet. And so I believe that's important to see you have a you have different ways to understand this question. I believe that the affirmative action, the recent movement to guarantee the affirmative actions to get access to the university, to undergraduate slots in the Federal Brazilian University was a conquest. But we need to see that if you open what the Brazilian Congress really approved, we didn't approve a real racial equality affirmative action policy, because our policy is based more in the public school than in the racial criteria, and it makes a very important difference in terms of the content of this recent law. And I believe that the whole country, I believe we know, I believe that all of us here know that Brazilian society is crossing a very big crisis nowadays. And this crisis is not just economic. And I believe that we have different possibilities. I published a little article in the LASA forum last year, which I described this kind of contradictions inside the Brazilian society in terms of the racial relations. I have good reasons to be very optimistic, but I have good reasons to be very pessimistic. I have very good reasons to understand that the Brazilian elites all the times discovered a way to overcome the defies that came from the social movements. And I believe that you must take care, because nowadays, even this recent conquest that black movement in Brazil got, maybe they could be reversed over the years. You can remember, for example, what happened in the US. In the 60s, there was the civil and political rights law approved. But in the end of 70s or the beginning of 80s, a lot of affirmative actions policies have been reversed because the new contest appeared and the correlation of forces changed. And it is easy to see that the Brazilian society is facing a strong crisis, and we don't know about the correlation of forces in the future. And maybe some of these recent advances of our society may be reversed. I hope not, but it's impossible to forget this possibility.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Welcome.
So I have a question about, so I'm really interested in sort of the US-Brazil comparison and how in Freirean thought that was sort of in the back of his mind when he was thinking about Brazil in the 30s. He was also comparing it to his own experience in the US South at the time, right? So from what you described, we have Brazil and the US as these societies that have perpetuated racial inequality in different ways. And I was wondering if we fast forward to today and looking at Brazil with some affirmative action going on, and in the US with the idea of a post-racial society, in quotes, how can we think about strategies to address racism perhaps differently in Brazil? Because I know that affirmative action has been accused in Brazil of being sort of an importation of an American model of race. So is there any thought, what are your thoughts on strategies to address racism given the difference in sort of mechanisms of racial inequality in each country?
Well, it's excellent questions. I believe in the Brazilian, the motto of the Brazilian flag is ordem e progresso. Because our elite, part of them was positivist, and they believed that the main force of the main objective of the Brazilian society is to become a modern country. That's why, for me, modernidade in my book is so important. It's assumed a so important role in my description of the Brazilian society and so on. And I believe that if I had the sufficient power, I would change this mood. I would like to put social justice and progress, because I believe that this kind of objective never had been present in our objective as country, and I believe that it is intertwined with the racial inequality in general. And so I believe the main objective of the Brazilian society, if I were the president, if I were the owner, if I had some power, I believe that the main objective of the current Brazilian society would be how to reduce this strong level of the social and racial inequality. Brazil, even after the recent advances from the Lula government, is still a very uneven country, and it is visible. It is still visible in the Brazilian streets and so on. And I believe that in part our racism, the Brazilian variation of racism, I may assume it like this, Brazilian variation of racism, in part is based on this aspect of the how to reproduce the social and the racial inequality. Our way to be racist is not based on the principle of the segregation for itself, but it's a principle of the social pyramid position of everyone in our hierarchy, in our social hierarchy in Brazil. And I believe that if you combat the racial inequality in its socio-economic aspect, it will generate, it will not solve the problem, it will not overcome, it will not address the problem of racism. I'm not naive about this. If you solve the problem of the racial inequality, it will be immediately you will solve the problem of the racism in Brazil, because you know that the racism in part could be strengthened from the resistance of the dominant group against this kind of measure. Like in the West, for example, in the post-Civil War in the West. And so it's important to remember. But I believe that this kind of civilizatorian exam that the Brazilian society will need to be prepared to make. Because it's really, it's a kind of another hypothesis that you can assume. would be possible to for the Brazilian society to reduce the racial inequality without generating racial conflict? Because my main hypothesis, the racial inequality is the kernel of the national identification. I am in this way, I am renewing the old Joaquim Nabuco hypothesis. Slavery was the base, racial inequality is the base. When the mulata is dancing, no problem. Let's clap here. But when the mulata try to go to the university, no, please. Why not? And so that's why I believe that this kind of hypothesis, I think, I describe it, this kind of concern in this book. Sorry if I make an advertisement of my own book all the time. You know that it's impossible to forget it. But I believe that it will be the member. It's not easy to overcome the racism. You know that. But at least I believe it's possible to recreate a national consensus in Brazil based on the principle of the diversity and based on the principle of equality instead of the inequality that is based nowadays.
So I wanted to push back on what you just said. I thought your talk was wonderful, but the left in Brazil, historically, this is something that Abdias Nascimento fought, build its arguments that the way we overcome racial inequality is by economic equality. So the Communist Party and all other groups built that as their argument. And one of the things that was important about the Black United Movement, which is they introduced race as a category of analysis and said, as you said today, very articulate, that it's a fundamental way of understanding Brazilian society. Yet, in your last answer, it seems like you fall right back into the trap of the argument of the communists and others, the Workers' Party, that the way we will eliminate racism is by economic equality. We need to make the public school systems better than the private school systems so that people can go to the university, et cetera, all the arguments about the
I get it.
So I think I'm kind of want to push back or follow up on what Paulo is saying, is that how do you confront institutional racism at the same time that you're fighting for economic equality, which implicitly will affect overwhelmingly Afro-descendants because they're the people who are most marginalized economically. How do you confront that?
No,
And so,
excellent question.
and it's not, in my mind, the solutions given so far are very partial. Perhaps what could be gotten: teaching Pride in Africa, learning African history, implementing programs of conscientization in the universities and the schools. But it seems so insufficient for what needs to be done. And of course, one of the answers probably is having Marcelo speak about this, or having people talk about this, put it on the table, and deflating this myth, which is the underpinning of everything which we see is the problems of Brazil today. So I guess I wanted to see if you
No,
had more.
excellent question, James. I believe that really I incur in this risk when I assume that you must pursue the racial and social equality as our main objective, and so some people from the Communist Party, Worker Party, and so on could tell me, well, I agree with you because we don't need to talk about race and you need to talk about class. And I know absolutely it's a very important question for us, but it's not so easy to address these questions. For example, 90% of the Brazilian black and brown Brazilian students about between 7 years old and to 15 years old study in the public school. And I believe that you must address this question, because I believe that if the public school in Brazil, if it faces so many problems to overcome, I believe that it is in part is a product of the institutional racism. I know that, for example, the favelas school, the schools located closer to favelas in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, whatever Brazilian city or capital, they will suffer the shortage of resource because they are attending black and brown students as well, favelado population, and so I believe that this kind of question is not so easy because, in part, maybe I believe that the black movement in Brazil could fight for the hegemony of the social movement because there are a lot of realms of the social activism in Brazil in which the racial and the social aspect will be intertwined. Or, for example, the problems of the public health service in Brazil, the problem of the Sistema Único de Saúde in Brazil. We know that we need to address, at the same way, the problem of the SUS, because there is the lack of sufficient resources to attend the whole population, and you know that there is the institutional racism inside SUS. In general, the left wing would accept the first argument, but you will show some resistance in accepting, in agreeing the second leg. And I believe that when you introduce these questions combined, I believe that you are producing a new kind of discourse. Or, for example, in the field of the labor market, we know that, for example, maybe, I don't know I don't have any statistics to give you, but it's not far from of the reality that many of the majority of leaders or black movement leaders came from the trade union movement in Brazil, like Vicentinho, like Luiz Alberto, Brazilian deputies, for example. And I believe that it's an important point of reflection. In part, some of the Paim, for example, they were leaders of their trade unions, and I believe that they got a way to assume a classist discourse. In the same time, they assumed their racial discourse. And maybe in a country like Brazil, which the most part of population are Afro-descendant, we must identify our specific demands and try to combine some of them. I believe that you don't a kind of cunning that you must avoid all the time will be to assume just the classist aspect of the social reivindication without paying attention to the racial and ethnic inequality aspect of this demand. But it's not so easy. Maybe I could give you a very easy answer. Oh, no, you must assume that the racial part, it's not so easy because, in part, the black population and brown population in Brazil, like in the West, they depend more on the public policies than the white population that get the services from the market. And it creates a kind of problem, a kind of problems for us that you must address it. Okay?
There are a couple of things. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Just made me think about one is, as other folks like Salas Augusto dos Santos has argued, is that it doesn't address the issue of kind of the moral compass, or that people are struggling with a sense that blacks are inferior, right? So there's that aspect of it. And also that even wealthy blacks experience discrimination and understandings about their capacity to lead, or their capacity to access certain resources, or deserving of certain resources, and so forth. So I think only focusing on, for example, class issues doesn't really address some of these other kind of broader questions. And also the example of the focus on slavery, what I find almost fascinating about Brazilian society is how much there's a focus on remembering the slave past, right? So a lot of the soap operas kind of glorify colonial period, right? And I think it does a different kind of work, which I thought your talk really brought up. It does a different kind of ideological work than, let's say, the focus on slave films in the United States, right? So there, I would say that there's the sense of kind of return to the good old days, or kind of a naturalization of social hierarchy around race and sexuality, which I think is really, really important. The question that I wanted to ask you, that I'm really struck by, is all of the statistics that have been produced, all of them have been generated. We've used a lot of them in our own classes and in our own research that shows racial inequality, right? Especially some of the new statistics that show that blacks and brown, despite how they self-identify, have similar life chances, access to health care, literacy rates, et cetera. Can you go back again to that initial question about, even with the statistics showing the vastness of racial inequality, why there's such an kind of unwillingness to make advances around questions of race, right? If you could just speak a little bit more about what else you think might be going on.
No, okay. So I believe that, again, it's a pretty important question. First of all, the insistence of the global, Rede Globo, to broadcast soap opera based about the slavery society. And in general, they will show the Brazilian slave society as a peaceful society. And I believe that it will dialogue with some aspects of my current arguments. They will insist that Brazil, the racial inequality is natural. It's part of the social paysage. That's why I am insisting that the racial inequality is the kernel of the national identification in Brazil. It's a reason of pride. It's a reason of pride. Because we don't have conflict. We don't have racial conflict. It's reason of pride, to be proud. Well, we don't have conflict. But the legend will talk about another personage, another participant in this soap opera. We don't have conflict because everybody will converge that the racial position inside the social pyramid is natural. You don't need to contest it. You don't need to defy it. And it will be my answer to you about when you ask me for why the statistics sometimes or even generally don't create a great impact on the Brazilian society. Because in part there is a process of naturalization of these statistics. If I say the illiteracy rate of black and brown is about 10% in 2016, maybe I could understand, well, this reality is caused from the social and historical reasons, and it is an injustice. Or maybe I could think, well, it is normal. They don't want to go to the school. They don't want to make an effort of studying. The percentage of women, black and brown women, that never had some kinds of, how could I say, saúde reprodutiva, reproductive health exams, for example. They don't care about themselves. You know that the statistics may, you must use them, but the same way, we must understand that our society can produce a process of naturalization of them again. And I believe that it is more probable in Brazil than in the US. Because in the US, the racial inequality, even after the post-racial society, it is visible. But in Brazil, it is hidden. It's not so hiding. It's not hiding. It's visible too. But there is a discourse that try to hide the so visible reality. And that's why I believe that the soap opera that will tell a history about the slavery, so everybody is, In the end, everything was a great carnival. February, master, slave in the street, they were enjoying together. It's a kind of discourse. It is easy to see in the carnival last week in Brazil. We see that it is easy to notice that the official discourse tended to describe the Brazilian society like this. But I believe that you must take care when you produce some statistics in denouncing, to express the social aspect of the social reality, but all the time trying to avoid naturalizing this information because it is possible. It is possible. And as it's a kind of national traits of the collective identification, it's possible. No, yes, yes.
Thank you. So when we look at affirmative action here in America, the group that has benefited the most from affirmative action is the white American woman. And so, we're wondering if you are looking at this affirmative action critically, and if there has been any independent initiatives that would be focusing on helping to elevate, Black women, Black children, not leaving them out.
May I just, as one of the organizers behind
Yes,
the scenes,
please, do
could we
this.
take the other question and then we could answer the two?
Yeah,
We have to
and then
kind of
we will
finish
conclude.
at 1:30. So maybe, I think Judy had a question.
Basically, I wanted to thank you for a talk that helps lend a sophistication, a further sophistication, to how we're thinking about things in Brazil. You get a lot of arguments that push back against the cultural, and I understand, why people would say, don't think about Brazil and Afro-Brazilian history and society only in terms of the cultural. But your argument allies economics to a question of imaginary, a national imaginary. You can't get to that without passing through the cultural. But it raises something that's very important, because the question then for me becomes, if you get to a point where Afro-Brazilians take the consciousness of themselves as the majority, further to saying, well, what if we had a different national imaginary? Because the United States has the American dream, and it is a guiding model for everybody. Don't pretend that it doesn't guide you, whoever you may be, black or white. We're raised with it in school, and it guides a way to think about the United States. What if the national imaginary in Brazil were another? And the only group, obviously, who could create this other one is this group that is, in fact, the majority. So I don't see the fruitfulness of a separation of this is about economics, and that's just about culture. And what your description and your work, your analytical work, pushes us to do, I think, is to think about that in more sophisticated ways. The question of a national imaginary is not just about culture and something. It's also about the economic and social model. And I'm always thinking, when I meet Brazilians, black or white, what if Brazil had a different national imaginary? And if so, who's going to create that?
Well, thank you for your new questions. Excellent. Well, I believe that all the time some affirmative action policies will face the risk of benefiting some groups, and not benefiting the other groups in the same way, because the racist dynamic inside the society will have conditions to be reproduced all the time. For example, in Brazil, your question in Brazil would be, you would ask about the kernel of our recent law that you approved, at least in the access of to the university, because our law is not based on race. Please pay attention, because maybe as you are receiving some information from Brazil, that no, in Brazil they approved the affirmative action to blacks and brown population. yes, there is this component inside the affirmative action policy to universities, to public universities. But our main, the reasons or the main objective of this law of affirmative action in Brazil that we approved in 2011, 2012, is to guarantee social equalization, not racial. Racial is part. And it makes a big difference. Our law is the federal university in Brazil is in general is better than the private universities, and the federal universities that belong to the federal government, half part of the end of the slots will be destined to students that came from public school. Okay, and so we know based on some statistics, we have in Brazil a national basic school exam, we call SAEB, Sistema de Avaliação do Ensino Básico in Portuguese. It's a kind of, you have here in the US, the same thing. I've forgotten the name. What's the name? No, there is yes, and you have in Brazil, and you know that even inside the public school there are a lot of racial inequality in terms of the proficiency of the students. And if you create a law just based on public school, we will reproduce the same racial inequality. But we need to assume that in Brazil we had the second component, racial component, and it will help the law to get their main objective, at least in part. But it will make a big difference, because if I decide that the public school is my target, I know that the racial problem is a subsidiary, is a second problem, no less important than the class, like the James question aspects. And I believe that we will have all the time in Brazil this possibility, a law that will benefit more poor white students than black and brown or Afro-descendant population in Brazil, because it came from the draw, how the draw has been shaped. And really, we have. But we need to pay attention to, in Brazil, there is a great resistance from the hegemonic society, the hegemonic white society, not to assume that there is racial inequality, but to assume that we need to address it. It's important. Maybe I've forgotten to emphasize this aspect in my presentation. Everybody in Brazil will know that there are a lot of racial inequalities in whatever realm of the social life that you are studying. Nobody will deny it. Nobody will have the courage to deny it. But maybe, in part, they will assume there is racial inequality, but it's not a racial, but a social problem. And in part, there is a racial inequality, and what's the problem? What's the problem? It's not a problem. Let's problematize our breathing oxygen. Oh my God, oxygen. Oh, it's not a problem, it's natural. And so it is in part, will make this second aspect may put our recent conquest of the black movement in Brazil under risk. Yes, you are right. These recent affirmative actions laws that have been approved in Brazil recently will be permanently under risk, because it is based on the class perception and not based on racial perception. The class inequality perception and not in racial inequality perception. And that's why to be under risk all the time. And you need to monitor, and you need to analyze the real effects of this law, and so on. You are completely right. Really, we need to be very concerned about this. And the second question, well, I need to be here with you. May I be with them, Professor James, the rest of the afternoon. I believe, no, but just a few words to conclude my presentation. And thank you so much for all of you to be with me until this time. And I believe that it is really important to reunify the different fields of social sciences, realms of knowledge. Maybe this kind of a positivist way of researching is good for the European-wide society, but not for us. We need to reintegrate this and to overcome this kind of division. And I believe, I am economist, and I tried to make a dialogue with anthropology authors, because I was, and I am absolutely sure that the anthropologist gave to the Brazilian, in the beginning I thought the Brazilian society, after concluding this book, to the white Brazilian society, such a strong argument to explain the social inequality in Brazil. Because it's important again, Professor Anani, it's important again to describe Brazilian society as a very, very, very uneven society. But in the same time, we don't have the same level of social and political conflict. Please don't mean what I'm talking about as a peaceful society. Brazil is not a peaceful society. There are about 50,000 homicides per year in Brazil. It's not a Pacific society. I'm talking about a society which the level of the social and political conflict is low. Which kind of ideology is this that is so powerful that can guarantee the social peace even under this condition? You must have. That's why I am a little skeptical of capability of the US society to really use the post-racial society discourse, because you need to have something that you have not just in the Brazilian society, but you have in just the Brazilian society, now in Portuguese, jogo de cintura. Capability. And jogo de cintura from the elites. From the elites. What is the jogo de cintura from the elites? Capability of guarantee the social and political peace even inside a very strong and even society, based on racial discrimination all the time, but it look like invisible. That's why I believe that you must understand the cultural aspect will influence the model of development. It's my main problem, model of development. Please don't confuse me. I'm an economist, and my main concern will be about model of development. It will be about social statistics. It will be about what will the Brazilian government will make with the pre-sal resources. Well, I believe that it's the main question. I know it's not easy, and I'm very skeptical if one intellectual, one academic, one specific group will be able to destroy or to overcome so pervasive kind of ideological argument, because it arose 50, 100 years ago. They are strong, we are weak. They have the power. We have the book, we have the letter, we have the pens. We don't have the capability of to recreate an entire national imagination discourse. But I believe that you must give our contribution, at least to denounce, at least to defy, at least to suggest all the possibilities of society. Nowadays, if I need to conclude, I am optimistic in terms of what we can do. We live under a democratic society, and you can struggle for a new kind of reality. But I'm not so optimistic when I think of the real effective capability. I believe that the Brazilian society in the next period will face several backlash in terms of the social conquest that you gained recently, because I believe that the right wing is coming and they will try to reverse some recent conquests. But I'm a professor, I must be pessimistic. Because if I be optimistic, I don't know, maybe I will lose my job. We're not allowed to be optimistic being a professor. Thank you so much.